Hello. Thanks everyone for joining. You can see a couple people coming in. I'll just give it a second before starting, but if you are here and you can hear me, just either go off mute or message me in the chat to let me know that you can actually hear me okay. Oh, I see a thumbs up from Marielle. Thank you for doing that. Also, as always, if you want, go off video. If you don't want to, you certainly don't have to. But yeah, I'd love to make this more of a group experience. Today, we will be talking about chapter 3, which is distribution. So far we've talked about basically, what are you writing? If you're creating your publication yourself, how are you actually creating that? And then now today we're going to talk about, assuming that you have a publication, assuming that you have things to distribute, how you actually go about doing that, and almost like the theory or how you might think about doing that. Okay, so it looks like we've got a couple people in. This group is always a little smaller than the other one. So with that said, I'm just going to jump in and we can get started. As always, if you have any questions throughout, just interrupt me, especially because we're a pretty small group here. Or I'll be monitoring the chat if you don't want to go off mute yourself. But yeah, let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen. And as I said, today we'll be talking about distribution. So I'm going to actually present this. So we've got full screen. So as I mentioned, we've gone through 2 chapters so far. And at the end of the book, there is this almost like infographic of what the whole book covers and how you might think overall at a high level about your publication. And if we think about the first 2 chapters that we went through so far, it was really this upper section. That was chapter 1. So how are you thinking about writing? Who are you writing and what are you writing about? Who are you writing for and what are you writing about? That's your personal monopoly and your true fans. Now with chapter 3, we're moving on to this section, really this middle section plus a little bit down here. We're talking about now that assuming you have information that you want to get in front of people, how do you actually get that information in front of people? So today we'll be talking about the 6 types of channels, how you might think about that. We're not going to dive too deeply into SEO because that is the whole topic of chapter 4 in next week's live sessions. But we will be talking about the different types of channels here, this codes framework that kind of helps you think through how you might leverage different channels and interweave them. And then also we can dive into your website and how you capture traffic, how you actually turn that into more of a foundation through your newsletter and modals. And yeah, so really we'll be talking about this middle section. And then in future weeks, we'll talk about SEO here, and then monetization is the last chapter. So with that said, this chapter is really all about if there's going to be 2 aspects of writing and distributing your content, or really creating a publication overall, there's the first step, which is creating the information, which is certainly an important step. And without that, without creating really amazing content, as we've discussed before, you really can't stand out amongst the crowd. But a lot of people do think that if they go and they take that first step and they create amazing content, that their stuff will just, somehow get in front of a lot of people. But that's actually not the case. In terms of this, if you were to think of this as an equation, a lot of people spend a lot of time on that first aspect and very little time on the second aspect. Or if they spend a lot of time in the second bucket, they're not thinking about it in almost like a systematic approach. They're really just saying, oh, I'm just going to throw this on Twitter. I'm just going to do a couple things. And they hope that somehow that kind of rogue approach will get them anywhere. When in reality, just as much intentionality needs to go into the second part of that equation as the first part of that equation. And there's this quote from the book that says, no matter how good your content is, if you don't invest in getting it in front of people, no one will see it. That sounds obvious, but if people actually reflect on how they take the content that they create and put it in front of people, I can almost guarantee a lot of people will end up looking more like the left-hand side here, where they invest, again, a lot of time in content creation, but when it comes to content distribution, there's just not as much investment, whether it's in terms of time or intentionality going in there. in reality, the people that I've seen do extremely well with their content, especially, and this is true with products as well, are people that invest just as heavily or almost as heavily in terms of distribution. That's one way that I've certainly been able to distribute my content or have my content seen more prevalently. Also, people like Harry Dry, a lot of the people that you see online that are actually doing quite well are just as much creators as they are marketers. And in order for you to really reach that many people as well, you should invest as much in content distribution. Some other kind of dynamics that you should keep in mind here are that with almost everything you do in life, your efforts compound. And the reason that this is important here is because as you invest in different types of channels, some people, not all people, tend to take a more spray and pray technique where they basically go and they say, I'm just gonna, throw this up on Twitter and post it on Reddit and Hacker News and, maybe do a little bit of SEO, and they're just kind of like hoping that something will stick. But the problem with that is that all of these platforms at least have some sort of compounding nature to them, where whether it's you start to integrate into a community, whether it's your domain authority increasing, whether it's you actually building up a social following on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, all of those have some sort of element where there is an inflection point where at the beginning your efforts don't seem to pay off at all, but then after a while your efforts really do start to compound over time. And for that reason, excuse me, if you take this more spray and pray technique, you end up just, if we imagine this green square as your effort, it only gets you so far. And if you go and you try tweeting for a couple weeks and then you give up, and then you try Instagram for a couple weeks and give up, then really you're never actually getting past this inflection point where your efforts start to pay off. And so you do want to keep that in mind when you're doing distribution, in that you need to balance this need to test things, but also to actually give it a go in, again, an intentional and sustained way, so that your efforts actually can pass this inflection point, so that your efforts actually pay off. So that leads me to this third concept. And by the way, I won't be going through, this chapter is super long, so this will be focused pretty heavily on how you might think about distribution. We can get into very specifics as well if you have any questions, but if I were to go through everything in this chapter, word by word, it would be hours long, and I don't think anyone wants to listen to me talk for hours. But that leads me to this concept of exploring and exploiting channels. So again, one thing that I see people maybe miss or skip over a lot when they're thinking about distribution is that they're just kind of hacking at it. And that can work. Certainly people can be successful through that, but I recommend having a little bit more of a thoughtful approach. And this explore and exploit technique is actually from computer science. If people are interested, there's an amazing book called Algorithms to Live By that really dives into this. But this idea is that as you're approaching new channels, you want to balance this concept of like trying new things, but also leveraging or maximizing your potential on things that you're trying. And so in the book, I talk about this approach. You don't need to follow this exact approach, but the concepts behind them, I think you should leverage, is that there's always going to be constant channels. And constant channels I talk about in the book, some of the ones that I recommend are things like a referral program that's just always there, always running. I do think people should optimize for SEO pretty consistently. But this constant channel, I have labeled here in blue. So things that you always do. But outside of that constant channel, you want to consider, okay, at the beginning, you're going to test channels. And in the book, I say that you should test channels for at least a couple weeks. Because again, if we go back to this idea, if you do it for a day or 3 days or even a week, you're not really going to get enough data. The 2 to 4 weeks that I mentioned in the book is pretty arbitrary. But the idea still stands that you test for a while and look for indicators that your efforts are actually paying off to some degree. And then once you've gone through a testing period where you feel comfortable to actually discern whether your efforts are paying off or not, you either kind of remove channels, or you continue with these channels, and you, in some cases, you even double down on those channels. The other thing I would mention here is, after a while, once you've actually established a certain number of channels that work for you, you can continue to explore every so often. But once you have a bulk of channels of, like, let's say 3 to 5 channels that really work for you, I would focus on exploiting. And in the book Algorithms to Live By, they really explain this much better than I can. But you want to, over time in the spectrum of how you're operating, you want to explore more at the beginning and then eventually exploit more later on in your journey. And this will be a constant theme throughout this talk, in that the things that you do at the beginning of when you're building a publication don't necessarily need to be, or in many cases shouldn't be, the things that you're leveraging later in your efforts to scale, because you have different needs, your audience expands, things like that. So at the beginning, you really want to focus on exploring. Over time, you want to focus on exploiting. And then the final thing to mention on this slide is just that over time, as I mentioned, your needs will change, and it's okay to retire channels if that makes sense. So if certain channels were really great for you in the beginning, I talk about communities being kind of like this in the beginning, where they're really great at the beginning when you're trying to find those 100 true fans. But later on, let's say you have 100,000 subscribers, maybe that Slack community of 500 people no longer serves you. So maybe you don't focus as much there. But the idea here is that you should be consistently reevaluating channels as you're exploring and exploiting. Now, I see, let me just make sure that Chris said that he can listen to me talk for a while. Well, that's great. But anyway, I do recommend, if you guys have questions, if you haven't read the book, I won't be diving into everything in chapter 3, as I mentioned, but if you do have any questions, happy to answer them as we go through. But let's move on to the types of traffic. And so we've got 6 types of traffic. And as I mentioned in the book, different channels can fit or almost cross multiple of these buckets. And these are not like in some textbook somewhere, but these are just things to help you kind of think through what types of channels, how they operate, and the almost like qualities of each of the types of channels and how they combine to compose your strategy. So the first one is Bedrock. Bedrock is the type of channel that I think people overlook the most, and I'll talk to it a little bit more in a second. But the first one I actually want to talk about is viral channels. And viral channels are the ones I want to talk about first, because viral and social channels tend to be, not always, but tend to be the channels that people focus on the most, especially if you're an independent. A lot of people, when they're thinking of where they can spread their content, they're like, oh, I'm going to put it on Twitter, or I'm going to put it on Facebook or Instagram, and I'm going to post it on Hacker News. The reason that people tend to approach viral channels and social channels first is because A, they're the most obvious, and they tend to be pretty low effort, right? It's much easier to just post a link on Hacker News or to tweet about something, within, I think, 180 characters. But what you need to know about these channels is that they typically, more so viral than social, are not sustainable channels. So if we think about, let's say your goal as a publication is to one day get 30,000 page views a day. There are many ways that you can get to that place. And I talk about this helicopter analogy in the book, but the idea here is that if you were to try to get to a sustainable level of page views, you cannot do that with viral channels. It's pretty much impossible. So if you wanted to do that and you posted on Hacker News, let's say, Hacker News, if you do get to the top few spots, will get you 30,000 page views in a single day. That's amazing. Really easy, just posting on Hacker News. But if you wanted to do that in a repeatable way, that's nearly impossible. I don't think anyone's ever managed to do that. And so the idea of viral channels is that they can be really great. They hit your dopamine centers. You're very excited that you wrote this article and now all these people are seeing it, but they're not sustainable. And just as quickly as you go up, you go down. So that's really important to know. There's certainly a place for viral channels. I utilize them, but they cannot be the core of your strategy. The other thing to note about, so each of these has their pros and cons, right? We talk about them more deeply in the book. Social, the pros are that, again, they're relatively easy to get involved with, but social, the downfall here is that you don't own anything, right? So whether you're on Twitter or Facebook or any sort of platform that is governed by an algorithm, you don't run that algorithm. And for that reason, if you post a tweet, you have a certain number of followers that you can hope to reach, but there's no guarantee there. On the other hand, something like a newsletter, if I send out my newsletter, I know that that newsletter is going to reach X number of people's inbox every single time. And so the important thing to note about social is that it can have some bedrock similarities in that you're building up a social following over time, but keep in mind that you never own anything on social. And so if we go back to Bedrock now, the good thing about Bedrock is that Anything that is a Bedrock channel, Google, of course, is run by an algorithm, but anything that's a Bedrock channel, you can trust over time. The idea is that anything that you do today will benefit you now and into the future. Now, it's normally a slower incline, right, than something like a viral or social channel, but everything that you do today is almost like adding a slab that builds up every time you add another slab and another slab and another slab, and they're additive. They're not necessarily something that, again, will go up today and then go down the next day. And then I'll quickly go through these other ones. Syndicate is basically, a lot of them have similar aspects. These are things like YouTube, a podcast, something like Pinterest. The idea is that you're actually taking something that you published probably on your own blog and you're putting it somewhere else. In many cases, you need to repurpose it, perhaps like creating a video, creating a podcast, an audio version of it, things like that. Syndicate channels can be very great, but they are more difficult often to do because, again, you're needing to almost create another version of your content for a syndicate channel. Targeted channels are really great in the beginning. So these are things like communities, whether it's Slack or Telegram, Facebook groups, things like that. The great thing about communities is that they're very beneficial early on, right? That's how you can find your 100 true fans, how you can find people who you integrate with and communicate with and become friends with, and then maybe those people actually, help you build the initial building blocks of your social following, things like that. So targeted channels, which tend to be communities, are great early on, but again, they're not necessarily something that's going to take you from thousands of followers to, let's say, millions, right? And so that's something to keep in mind. Remember when I said that certain things that work for you now may not work for you in the future, and vice versa. And then finally, paid channels. The benefit, obviously, of paid is that they are infinitely scalable, but only if you have the budget. And so paid, it's really important that if you're going to tackle paid channels, that you have an understanding of your LTV. And what I mean by that is, if you're selling a product, so not content, but a product, it's very easy for you to say, hey, I'm willing to spend X dollars on Facebook ads because I know that a certain number of people will convert, and therefore I'm willing to spend this much, and it can be ROI positive. That's much harder to do with content. It's a little bit easier with newsletters relative to blogs, but I would just say that before delving into paid acquisition, that you really get a better understanding of your customers, how much they're worth, before blowing a bunch of money on paid, especially with content. So I kind of went through these pretty quickly, but the ideas here all kind of relate to this concept or this framework that I mentioned in the book, which is codes. So codes is just something that I made up, but it helps you think through, again, the different aspects of these channels. So how certain ones are higher cost or lower cost than others, how certain ones you have much stronger ownership over relative to others, how some of them are very dependable. This is one that I want to highlight in particular because it's something that is overlooked, again, because people tend to be attracted to things like viral or social channels, when in reality, if you're really in content for the long game, the best thing that you can do is focus on dependable channels, right? So again, dependability is this concept that if I wake up today, do I know how many page views I'm going to get? Do I know how many page views I'll likely get in 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years? And do I know that at least roughly, if I do certain things, that I can advance, those page views now and into the future? With things like viral or social channels, especially if you don't own an algorithm or you don't know how to rank places, then it's highly not dependable, or it's undependable. The other two things I'll mention here as part of codes are effort and scalability. So effort's a really interesting one because as humans, we tend to operate in a way that we look to things that are easier, when in reality, it often benefits us to actually approach things that are more difficult for a couple reasons. But one of them most prominently is that if you're doing something that's difficult, that in itself is likely weeding out many other people not willing to engage in that same thing. And so if you're doing things that are high effort, so SEO is competitive, but in the spectrum of many things that people are vying towards, it's still a place that has a lot of room for people because many people don't SEO optimize their articles. They don't actually spend time trying to increase their DA, etc. And so really just keep an eye on whether you're approaching certain channels just because they're easy, or whether they're actually the best channels for you. And the final one is scalability, where you just want to have a good understanding of what's the ceiling of this channel. And again, that matters in terms of where you are in your process. So when you're at the beginning, you don't need to find channels that are infinitely scalable, because that's not your goal, right? Your goal is to find, 100 subscribers, not 1,000,000 subscribers at the beginning. And so just keep an eye on which channels have more scalability and when you need that scale along your journey. And so just to give a couple examples, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I have two highlighted here where, again, you can kind of do an exercise where you think through different channels and how they fit along this codes framework in terms of cost, ownership, dependability, effort, and scalability, where basically certain channels are going to be much better in one region versus the other. And that's okay. You likely want a hybrid where you have certain ones that are super scalable, not necessarily dependable, and vice versa. But the two I mentioned here, which I often say are almost like no-brainers that rank very well across the spectrum, are optimizing your articles for SEO and a referral program. I'll quickly talk to both of these, but both of them are relatively low cost. With SEO, you can pay for links and things like that to accelerate how quickly you're really getting traction with Google, but overall, they can be super low cost. And they're both highly dependable, which means that, for a certain number of people that see your referral program, overall how many people will actually go and refer people. Same thing with SEO. That once you build up your bedrock of articles, I know that I'm going to get, X number of page views every single day I wake up. I'm going to get this. Of course, there's algorithm updates, but this is really important that if you're going to, again, build a publication for the future and one that gets past, a couple thousand page views a month, you need things that are dependable. So if you're thinking through, the 5 aspects here of the framework, the one that I call out that is the most important, in my opinion, is this dependability, because again, you won't be able to grow your publication sustainably if you don't have a dependable channel, whether it's your newsletter, whether it's, a lot of traffic coming through SEO. And again, I'll just quickly call out this effort column as well, where people tend to stray away from things that are high effort. SEO tends to be one of those. We won't get into the depths of SEO this week because that's next week's chapter. It's actually my favorite chapter because I think it's the one that can benefit people the most. But this is just a way to think about different channels and just ask yourself, do I have a dependable channel? Do I have a scalable channel that I'm leveraging? Am I really just going for things that are very easy or low cost? And just start to think through that. And again, what I mentioned before is that if you actually look at the 4 below here, and there's many other channels that I could put on here, but the 4 down here tend to be, if you were to ask people, what are you doing today to grow your publication? They often will look more like this and less like this. And of course, there's no right or wrong answer here, but it's important to recognize that these tend to be more often leveraged, and they aren't necessarily the best ways to sustainable success. So actually, we don't have that many people on here, but I want to do a quick poll. We did on the last call as well. So let me quickly launch it. Should be launched on your guys. So this is just a quick question. Based on whatever you're doing currently, which one of these buckets actually brings you currently the most traffic? So you should see the poll pop up on your side of, all right, we've got a couple people. All right, so I'll give it 5 more seconds before we end the poll. All right, end of the poll, sharing the results. So this looked very similar to when we ran it on the first live session for this chapter, where most people leverage social. Most people don't leverage Bedrock channels, and a couple on paid as well. So there's nothing wrong with this. I also benefit a lot from social channels. Twitter has been amazing to me, but it's just something to keep in the back of your head, where again, we tend to approach distribution in certain ways. And I think it's a result of us, sometimes going for things that are easier or that we're more comfortable with or that we have more exposure to. But just keep in mind, there are so many different ways to grow your publication. And I'm going to actually get into that a little bit more in the coming slides. But this slide kind of gives you an overview of the different types of channels that fit within this framework. So in terms of Bedrock, it's your newsletter, it's Google, it's potentially things like Quora Answers. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it gives you a sense of the fact that there's so many ways to actually grow your publication. So just try to brainstorm and expand past perhaps the like 2 or 3 things that you initially maybe might be leveraging right now. And I'm going to get into questions in a second, but I have just a couple more slides that I want to go over before that. And so, as I mentioned a little bit before, but what you're going to do at the beginning is going to change relative to what you're going to do later on. And when you're first starting, you want to focus on channels likely that don't scale. Just like, the common starter advice, doing things that don't scale to get your first users. It's the same thing in terms of getting your first subscribers. So just to give a couple examples, these are very popular publications or newsletters. Morning Brew, literally, the founders would go to business school classes, and they would actually, initially they would say, hey, we're Morning Brew, like go subscribe if you want business news. And no one, or not as many people would subscribe. So what they actually did is they would take a clipboard and they would get people to write down their emails, because they found that converted better. So that people would write down their emails, and then they would go type up those emails and then enter them into their ESP. Ryan Holiday would ask friends, and he actually talks about in one of his articles how for a year he wasn't even using an ESP, and he was just sending his newsletter with Gmail. And then The Skim did something similar to Morning Brew. They went to gyms, campuses. They basically, all of these people did, basically they found where their 100 true fans are, where their core audience was, and they went there. And later they found ways to approach this audience or similar audiences in more scalable ways. But when you're first starting to get traction, just do things that don't scale and find your people and find any way to access them. The other things that I would mention, especially if you're just starting out, are 2 concepts. The first is this concept of weak ties, which comes from a book called Give and Take from Adam Grant. And it basically is this concept where if you think of your strong ties, this is your family, this is your direct friends, your direct colleagues, your strong ties are likely a lot like you, right? And therefore, they can certainly help you. But if you expand a little past that to, your colleagues, friends, to communities that you're new to, things like that, where your weak ties actually maybe have a slightly wider range of people that they can access, but also maybe more insight past just people who are just like you. So definitely leverage your weak ties, and I talk about this more deeply in the book. The other thing that has benefited me and many others that I've seen successful in this online space is building in the open. So the best kind of analogy for building in the open that I've seen is this concept of, if your car breaks down, people are more likely to actually pull over and help you if they see you pushing your car versus you actually just, sitting on the side of the road hoping someone will stop. And the same thing is true. If people see your effort, your energy, your ambition to build something, they're more likely to actually go and help you accomplish that thing. So before getting into this bottom section, just curious to know of people on this call, and feel free to enter it into the chat. And I can answer these questions in a second, but how did you guys get your first subscribers? Was it through friends? Was it through paid ads? Would love to hear from people where they got their first subscribers. See, Chris said friends. Last time, so we did the same, or I asked the same question on the last call, and basically almost everyone also said friends. Karina says from existing professional network, friends, Facebook groups. Yeah, exactly. So what I commonly see, and this is great because this is how many of the biggest publications have gotten their first subscribers. It tends to be friends, direct contacts, or small niche groups, right? So again, those targeted groups that help you at the beginning that may not help you as much later on. Sarah's saying friends, reach out to my immediate network to build a base of 40 to 50 people to help keep me accountable. That's awesome. All right, so I'll answer the questions, I believe, in 1 or 2 slides because I've got to pause there. But let me just quickly finish this point, which is basically that, again, you're doing things that don't scale at the beginning, and then later on, you're going to find other channels that really help you kind of skyrocket. your publication. And what's important to note here is that this channel or combination of channels can vary incredibly, and you need to use that explore exploit tactic to find what those channels will be for you to really help you scale. And just to give a couple examples, so Starter Story by Pat Walls, he really leveraged Reddit to kind of zoom his site to tens of thousands of subscribers. The Hustle at the beginning, they really focused on what I would call kind of like viral content marketing. Morning Brew over time has focused a lot on paid acquisitions and things like giveaways. And so again, every publication will over time find what works for them. And so you really need to invest and figure out what works for you, so that you can also get past this initial stage of doing things that don't scale and, growing to a sustainable place. Just to quickly give a couple more examples, I asked people before the session to fill out a type form, had some people fill it out. This just kind of further bolsters what I'm saying in that, in terms of their number one channel, the channel that they leverage the most currently, it's, anything from Reddit to Udemy to LinkedIn to their newsletter. So again, it really differs between people and what actually resonates in terms of their audience and who they're looking for. I also asked them what other channels they're invested in: Facebook, LinkedIn. You see a lot of Twitter on here, their blog. So again, remember how I said that people tend to focus on social and viral channels? You see that a lot here, which is completely fine. But just again, remember that there are many other channels that you can leverage moving forward. And then finally, I asked them, how did you get your first 100 subscribers? And most of them, some of them aren't there yet. Some of them were through word of mouth, some of them through blog traffic, Facebook groups. So same type of thing, where they were doing things that don't quite scale, with the exception of paying them off. But again, this sounds like something that they did early on, and maybe when they wouldn't have the budget to do past the first, couple subscribers. All right, so here's where we can stop, and I saw a couple questions as well. I have more content, but let's just go through and make sure that I get to the questions that we have right now. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to also go off mute. But I'll start with Marielle's asking, can you clarify, again, syndicate versus social? Why isn't Pinterest social? Okay, so the idea here is that, again, certain buckets here definitely, or certain channels span two buckets, where, for example, I have Reddit, you can see in viral and paid. Reddit, for example, and I'll get to Pinterest in a second, Reddit is viral in that you can, like, if you post something on Reddit in a certain subreddit and it gets a ton of engagement, it can skyrocket to the front page, and then you actually get way more page views than even Hacker News. It's an insane number of page views. And so Reddit things can go viral on Reddit in the sense of something really taking off unexpectedly. But again, remember, viral channels like shoot up and then shoot right back down. But Reddit is also so one, you can advertise on Reddit, but I also have Reddit, you see subreddits in here in targeted, where a lot of subreddits, especially smaller ones, they're communities, right? There's moderators, they have certain regulations and rules in terms of what you can post. And so most of the time, your stuff, if you post it on Reddit, will not go to the front page and get like tens or hundreds of thousands of page views. It can be a viral channel, but it often isn't. It's often more of a targeted channel, at least at the beginning, where you're really only reaching people within that subreddit. So you have to learn who those people are. You have to engage with them in ways that they respond to positively. And so each of these channels can fit or span different, places, but it depends on how you're leveraging the channel. And again, these buckets aren't like the end all be all. This isn't in some textbook, but it's a way for you to think about, like, okay, I may be doing things hoping to, be a viral sensation, but am I doing things that really have a bedrock or foundational element to them? Yes or no. So Pinterest is one where, again, like Pinterest and YouTube, they are social channels, but more so the reason I put them into syndicate is because syndicate is anything that you have to repurpose in some way, right? So if you think about something like Twitter or Facebook, what you're doing is you're publishing your content in one place, right? And then you're likely taking that link and you're saying, hey, everyone, like I wrote an article about XYZ, probably not with that copy, but you get what I'm saying. And you're posting a tweet or you're posting something on Facebook. So you're trying to take your following, which exists on Twitter or Facebook, and get them to engage with your content elsewhere, right? With something like YouTube or Pinterest, you're actually creating something new for that platform, right? So in the case of Pinterest, you likely need to create some sort of infographic or imagery. With YouTube, you actually need to go and create a video of some sort that probably plays to the content that you're creating. And so that's the core difference here, is that syndication tends to be something that you need to create something new for that channel, versus something that's purely social is something you're building up a following on Twitter, not necessarily with the content that you're creating, but then you're utilizing that content, you're utilizing your following to get traffic elsewhere. So again, it certainly can span different buckets, but it's just a way to think about these different channels. Bedrock examples. So yeah, some examples here. Again, the way I define Bedrock is anything that if you invest in it once, it likely will sustain some benefit for a very long time. So if you bring in a newsletter subscriber, until that newsletter subscriber unsubscribes, which they hopefully don't, you have that newsletter subscriber engaging with you today until that date, right? And then same thing with SEO. If you get an article to rank somewhere, you will get page views for anyone from, until you lose your rank, who searches that query, right? And so the same thing with core answers. If you are the top core answer for a particular question, that you will get those page views while you are the top core answer for that question. And so these are, again, the reason that they're Bedrock is because for every question that you answer, for every page that you rank on Google, for every newsletter subscriber that you get, it's additive, versus things like a viral channel are not additive. You get that spike once. You may collect some of those subscribers into your newsletter, in which case you are kind of combining the two. But in most cases, the idea here is that you really want to invest in growing these things over time, because if not, it's really hard for you to get past a certain stage as a publisher. Benjamin's asking, you referenced Twitter as both viral and social. Could you differentiate a bit more? So let me, I shouldn't have said that. I might have said this, but Twitter I wouldn't label as necessarily a viral channel. Things can go viral on Twitter, but that's why you see, if you almost look at the graphs of these different types of channels, so viral looks like this, right? Where there's no foundational or bedrock element to it. Social channels look almost like a combination, or if you like superimpose bedrock and viral, in the fact that if you're on Twitter, you can have a particular tweet go viral, right? And be seen by way more people than even follow you. But overall, what you're doing on social is slowly building up your following there. And so I really kind of put Twitter into social. But one thing that I want to be clear on here is, again, this is not some sort of like textbook on the different types of channels. They certainly can span different buckets. It's more of a framework for thinking about how different channels operate and making sure that you're setting yourself up for success in the long run, in that you certainly have a dependable channel that you can build up over time, that you're not focusing all of your efforts into channels that you're like hoping for, a lottery ticket. And so just, it's helpful to think through, how do these different channels operate? What are the similarities, differences? And am I setting myself up for success in leveraging channels that kind of work together well and can actually form some sort of bedrock into the future? I can see. So one additional question is, which channel would you put podcasting in? And so podcasting, I would put, and I talk about it a little bit, is in syndication, in that, well, it's a little different if your whole publication, or let's say content engine, is a podcast and you're not actually writing on the side. But if you are writing articles and then you're trying to take some of that content and like repurpose it into a podcast, it's basically this idea of same thing as creating a YouTube video, or same thing as creating an infographic for Pinterest. You're going and you're actually like repurposing the content on another channel. Podcasting is something that in itself, if you're just talking about the podcast itself, does have certain bedrock functionality, just in the sense that if someone subscribes to your RSS feed, let's say, you have them listening to your podcast today, but probably also the next one you launch, probably also the next one you launch after that. The thing that you should note about podcasting, which is important, is that podcasts are very hard to build, especially if you don't have a prior audience. So if you think about the people that that or the podcasts that you listen to, and how many of them are started by people who already have had some sort of following. So for example, I work for The Hustle. Sam and Sean's My First Million podcast has done very, very well. But how was it launched? Well, it was launched, and for the first several months of it launching, it was actually promoted in The Hustle, which reached, 1 million subscribers every single day, or maybe at least every single week. And so the important thing to note is that a lot of people try to build podcasts, and there's nothing wrong with it. There's always room for new podcasts. It's the same ideas. There's always room for new publications. But just keep in mind that podcasts, because of the way that they exist, the way that audio is not easily shareable. Like, when's the last time you forwarded someone a podcast, or you took a snippet from a podcast and you sent it to someone? The shareability of a podcast is much less developed than written content. And so just keep that in mind, that podcasts, from my experience and from, other people that I know, it's much harder to grow a podcast, especially if you don't have a prior following. So I would put it in terms of certain dynamics, in terms of the syndication. It does have bedrock elements to it, but again, I just want to, I'm kind of going a little off topic here, but I want to emphasize that a lot of people want to build a podcast. There's nothing wrong with it. If you create a great podcast, you can get attention, but just keep in mind, the way audio exists online today makes it actually very hard to grow a podcast if you don't have an existing following. Before we move on, any other questions on these this framework, I guess you could say, for channels? Or also, if anyone has any questions about specific channels, I know last session we talked a lot about Twitter, any other channels or specifics about the channels that you'd like me to go through. I can see a question from Karina I'll get to in a second, but I will also say, if you don't have questions right now, but you do want to know, how do I leverage Twitter better? How do I leverage Reddit better? Things like that. Each section in the book goes a little more deeply into that. But again, I just don't think it would make sense to cover it on a call like this. But Karina's asking, what channels did you find most successful for growing your ebook? So, good question. A similar question was asked last time. And so I want to take a step back first and say that something that worked for me today only worked, or the things that worked for me today with my ebook worked because I spent the last 2 years building up channels or building up what I call a funnel, right? So even in marketing, whether it's product marketing, content marketing, most types of marketing have this concept of a funnel, right? So you bring people in so that people are aware of you. And then at some point that funnel gets thinner, and you're bringing in people who care or know of you, then care about you, and then eventually, would buy from you and things like that. There's many different ways to label a funnel, but the idea here is that if you were to launch an ebook today and you have no one who knows who you are or what you do, it doesn't matter if you use the same channels that I used. They won't work in the same ways. And the same thing is true for me. So I restarted on Twitter around 2 years ago, before I started creating products and tweeting and writing and all these things. Had I wrote literally the same book that I wrote, in 2020, but if I had written it sometime in 2018, even if it was just as good or not as good, whatever you want to call it, it was the same ebook, and I launched it on the same channels, no one would have cared. So what you need to do first, in general, regardless of the types of channels that you're using, is make sure that you're building up that funnel, so that whether it's through newsletter subscribers, whether it's through followers on Twitter, whether it's through your Medium or your YouTube or the communities that you're in, people know of you and care about you for some reason. Now, once you do that, then I would advise that you use the channels that you have built up. So for me, it ended up being Twitter was amazing for me with this particular ebook. I also posted a little bit on Indie Hackers, but that's basically it. And what I did to actually grow in terms of like this book being successful, I would say there's a couple things that I would specifically call out, which are some more repeatable than others. So the first thing that I would call out is that one, this is, everyone says this, but it's really important that you must create a really great product. This is the same thing that I've mentioned in terms of content. You must create great content, or else no one's going to want to engage with it. No one's going to want to share it. So once I created what I think ended up being a pretty good book, well, actually what ended up happening is that a lot of people did the work for me. A lot of people who ended up buying the pre-sale, which we'll talk about in a second. So there was around 300 or 400 pre-sellers. ended up sharing it, reading it, telling the world about it, becoming affiliates for it. And then that ended up doing a lot of the work for me. Now, with that said, one thing that I did do very intentionally is I added a pre-sale, and I adjusted the pricing in a way to get as many pre-sellers in as possible. And so what I did is, if you think about any product, you have at least one launch, right? The day that you launch the product. If you add a pre-sale, you're effectively adding at least one more launch, which is the day you launch the pre-sale, the day you actually launch the product, and then perhaps future launches as well. So that, just by nature of having a pre-sale, added an additional launch for me, in which case I got in those 300-400 people. And then, of course, I like launched it again when the actual book came out. And then during the pre-sale, I did a pricing model, which I did not make up, but it really helped me, where I basically started at $10, super cheap, super easy to get a couple people interested, a couple people buying it. And then for every 30 orders, it went up by $5 all the way to $30. And then I held it at $30. I may increase it in the future. I've actually increased it for a day or two here and there already. But the idea was that it made it, people respond to like scarcity and things like that. And so that really helped me get this cohort of people who cared about the ebook, who had already bought it. Now, the final thing that I think is actually across the spectrum of things that I've done, the most important thing is that I really thought about this question of, how do I actually get people to engage with this product once they have it, right? So it's one thing to get people to buy it, but I would have actually been really, felt like it wasn't a success if I had 300-400 people buy it and like 2 of them actually read the thing. So these live sessions are actually a product of that. So there are many other things, like creating a community chat. If you read the book, you'll see the first 2 pages, talk about like how people should read this book and how they can get the most out of it, and how you shouldn't read it like a novel, but instead like a textbook. All of that was very intentional with this question of like, okay, I'm creating this product. How do I actually get people to use it? Because the only way that people will use your product, the only way that people will share your product is if they've actually used it, right? And so with things like courses or online pieces of content, you want to make sure that people actually get value, because if not, they're not going to share your stuff. And so that was a big question for me, because most ebooks, a lot of people buy but don't actually read. And so I created these live sessions to make sure that, even if you don't read it, let me tell you the information in the book. I created the community in Telegram so that people could talk to each other, so people could ask questions, get value, even if they don't read the book. And then finally, again, if you get to the first page in the book, that was super intentional to kind of push people, nudge people, hey, like, I know this might be long. You don't need to read the whole thing. Let me help you get the most value from this. And so anyway, that was a very long way of saying that there was many different things that I tried to do to maximize the success of this book. And some of them are repeatable, some of them are less repeatable. But just to summarize, you need to build up your funnel, right? So you need to build it. You can use many different types of channels here to do that, but you need to build up your funnel over time. You can't just launch something one day and hope that people will care. You can also benefit from a pre-sale, because that's effectively like adding an additional launch date for you. And then you have this cohort of people all at the same time that are engaging with your product to basically create hype. You can use a pricing model like I did if you want. That I do think helped me. And as after the fact, other people have used it. It seems to have helped them as well. And then finally, as I said, really think about the fact that no one will share your product unless they've used it. And most of the time, if people buy like a physical product, they'll use it because they have it in their hands and they want to utilize it. But online content, very often, for whatever reason, people buy and don't actually use. So make sure that you're actually thinking through, how do I get people to engage with this stuff so that, they can actually get the value and therefore be basically like ambassadors for me. So I apologize for the lengthy answer, but that is what I did. And then to actually get back to the original question, the channels that I ended up using were mostly just Twitter and Indie Hackers. And then again, the affiliates of people who have actually read the book after the fact. Sarah's asking, what are good complementary channels in your opinion if the product is a newsletter? And so what I think you're saying is, Sarah, I'm assuming that you have like a gated newsletter. And so the thing that I mentioned in part or lesson 2 is that, yes, it's much harder to grow a paid newsletter for the reason that your product, or like what you have as your value proposition, is behind closed doors, right? And so therefore, if you have an open newsletter, a free newsletter, let's say, you can take the content from that newsletter and you can post it on Twitter and Hacker News and republish it on Medium and all these things. If you have Substack, you can't do that. I mean, you can do it to a certain degree, but most of your value is behind closed doors. And so what I talk about in that section is that what I recommend is to have one of two things. Either you build up your following first, so if we're talking about that same concept of a funnel, you don't gate things right away and you actually build up a following or an audience. I mentioned this also in the second chapter, if you look at the top publications within Substack, most of them came with their audiences. People like Pomp, Matt Taibbi he was a writer before. And so basically those people came with their audiences and were able to convert them to a paid audience. But if you don't have that, what I would advise you to do is build up that audience, build up the people who care about you, and then convert to paid later on. Now, if you don't want to do that and you want to start with paid, then what I would recommend is the second approach, which is this hybrid approach where you always have some of your content free, some of your content paid. You're utilizing the free content to distribute on these various channels, and then you're converting some of the people who engage with your free content to your paid content. And then the thing I mentioned in particular about this relationship between free and paid content, what most people do, what I would say incorrectly, is that their free content looks just like their paid content, and their paid content is just like an extension where let's say you get 3 articles on free and then 5 articles on paid. I've mentioned this throughout the book, and I think it's one of the key takeaways is that what people don't need these days is more content. There's enough content out there. People need better content, more actionable content, things that actually help them get from A to B, whatever they want to achieve. And so if you have you try this hybrid model where you have a free and a paid version, the paid version should be distinct and delineate from your free version. And an example I gave in that chapter is Henry from Rocket Ship Jobs. He basically has a free job board, or he shares these free jobs so people can access them. But then if you think, someone who wants to access these free jobs, what is their goal here? And their goal obviously is to actually get a job at these places. And so his paid content helps them get closer to that, and he helps them get closer to that by actually connecting them with people who work at the company, giving them templates to apply, things like that. And so to answer your question, again, it's kind of a long answer, but it's very hard to grow a gated newsletter for the reason that, again, your value is behind closed doors and you can't share it. You can't leverage these channels. And for that reason, I either recommend you start free, build up your audience, and then convert at some later time, or you have this hybrid model. But you do need to have some value that you're willing to put in front of people, because if not, it's incredibly hard to grow something that people can't engage with to any degree. Sarah saying, feels intuitive to lean into social, but a crazy amount of upkeep if you're focused on keeping it high quality. Yeah. Just reading some of the comments. Sorry about that. Okay, so another question is kind of unrelated, but regarding newsletters like The Hustle, Morning Brew, Robinhood Snacks, how do they create up-to-date news every day and submit it early in the morning? Do writers literally just write super late or early and send out the content? So I don't know about Robinhood Snacks. I don't know about Morning Brew. I can talk to The Hustle. I don't write for the daily email. When I used to write for The Hustle, I wrote for Trends, which was a weekly newsletter. But yes, the editors have to, every day they wake up and it's a new project for them, where basically they go and they have to scout out stories for the next day's newsletter. They spend at least, anywhere from an hour to multiple hours scouting stories. And then they have to pretty quickly actually write those stories. And then we have someone who actually goes and compiles, the email, puts them into the ESP and things like that. But yes, it's not rocket science, but it is difficult in that kudos goes out to the people on our team who do that. And also, the Robinhood Snacks guys and Morning Brew, where these people every day they have to wake up and produce. There's no days off because you have to send out that email the next day. So that's what we do, and that's what I assume the others do as well. Chris is saying another great thing for free newsletters is an upsell or an affiliate offer after the sign up. Yep. Cool. So, oh, actually, just had another question jump in from Tom. What is your next focus campaign to sell your book? Do you plan to have an upsell or on future campaigns? Yeah, so it's interesting. I wrote this book kind of on a whim. If any of you have followed the story of the book, it started from a tweet, and it was literally, I had written an outline for not even a book, but a pretty long form article about growing publications last year. I stumbled upon that outline this year and was like, like this should probably get out there. But it was the outline itself was 3,000 words. And so that was overwhelming to me. And I was like, man, if I'm actually going to go and take this 3,000 word outline and create something, again, it was never, at least initially, going to be a book, but if I'm going to create something from this, I should probably charge for it, because I never charge for anything. And it was kind of to help me get over the hump of like, okay, go do this. So I tweeted about it, and a lot of people were like, yeah, I'd totally pay $10 for it. And in fact, the reason I went with that tiered pricing strategy is because many of the people, at least a handful of them, had said, yeah, I'd totally pay $10, but you should charge more. And so that's why I went with the tiered strategy, where basically the tiered strategy is allowing me to get feedback from people in terms of, how much they would actually pay, because they're putting their credit card behind it. And so anyway, going back to Tom's question, I created the ebook, and then now it's out there, and it's gotten a much bigger response than I was expecting. And I've had many people ask me, oh, are you going to go create either like, a paid publication, let's say, that talks about this stuff moving forward? I've had people suggest that I go create a course. I have one company asking that I turn this into an audiobook. So I've had a lot of people saying that I should go create something with this. I'm still undecided on whether I want to, because I think that a lot of the things I do, so as I think many of you know, I have a full-time job. So anything that I do on the side is because I'm following some sort of curiosity or passion. I really try to limit the number of things that I do just to like make another dollar. And at the moment, I feel pretty happy with where this, like what has been delivered in this book and what it's accomplished. If I really wanted to maximize the return on this, I probably would go create like $500 or $1,000 course that's like an upsell to this. I may do that someday. Right now, that's not on the docket for things that I'm considering. I just have so many things that I want to go create that excite me. And to be honest, creating some sort of upsell just to get more money from this book doesn't excite me as much. So maybe people are hoping for something after this. If there is something you guys are hoping for, let me know, because I'm always open to things. But that's my answer for you, Tom. All right, so let me keep moving, just because we're already an hour in. I've got a couple more things that I want to talk about. We can do more questions in the end. So the next thing I want to talk about is, amongst the things that the channels that we just discussed, you might have noticed that the newsletter is itself, I refer to as a channel. And most people, or sometimes people, say or view their newsletter as their product. And it can be. But what I think is really important here is that your newsletter is a way to reach people, just like your Twitter is a way to reach people. And so I view a newsletter as a channel. It's a great one. It's a bedrock channel that builds up over time. And it's one that you should focus on. And so once we have the understanding that it's a channel, one thing that I really recommend is, if you're going to build up your newsletter, if you're getting traffic to your site, you need to capture that traffic, right? And you can capture that traffic through modals. There's other words for them, but basically the things that show up on your site somewhere that incentivize people to go give you their email so that you can engage with them in this bedrock way. And so what's important to note here, without going too deeply, is that you want to make it easy, so that if someone likes your work, you want to make it as easy for them as possible to go and give you their email. So certain things can be super spammy, and you don't want to edge towards that, where you're bombarding them all the time. You're making it very hard for them to actually exit out of things, or using dark patterns. But you do want to make it, again, easy if someone does want to subscribe, for them to do so. So what I do is, you want to make sure that you have modals at least in several places on the screen. Again, you don't need to blow up their whole screen and cover it, but you want to make sure, for example, if they're exiting, you hit them with that and you say, hey, if you enjoyed this, here's how you can subscribe. You want to make sure that at any time that they're on the page, they have an option, right? Again, it's not on their face, but they have an option. So you can see on mine in the upper right, there's always a place that someone, if they're looking to subscribe, they can go click there. I also add stuff within an article. So if someone's finding value and they're 2/3 of the way through, there's a prompt for them to subscribe. And then I also have something that always shows up in the bottom right. The final thing I mentioned is that you should also have a conversion optimized landing page that you can use. So if you go post an article on Reddit, let's say, and you post the whole article, and at the end you say, hey, if you like this or found value, subscribe. What you don't want to be doing is sending them to a blog post where they don't know where to subscribe and they're confused. You want a very conversion optimized landing page that you can direct people to when it makes sense. Other quick things I'll mention are that updating modals, I'll talk about a couple tactics, is one of the kind of easiest ways to drive a lot of value for yourself in terms of it doesn't take much time, but it can significantly impact your growth over time. You can also start to implement things like welcome series, referral programs, and giveaways are things that a lot of these huge newsletters like Morning Brew and The Hustle leverage in terms of really skyrocketing their newsletter subscribers. If you are using modals, there are 3 things that I recommend. There's probably more, but 3 things that I see that are, again, very easy changes that can significantly impact your conversion rate. And the reason that conversion rate in particular for modals is important is because, let's say, for any amount of traffic, whether you're completely new and you're getting 100 page views a month or you're getting 1 million page views a month, for 100 people that visit your site, some percentage of those people are going to give you their email. And if you are at 1% conversion rate, and you even just go to 2, that doesn't seem significant, but that's double. That means that for everyone that you bring in, whether something goes viral or you're just growing slowly, double the amount of people will engage with you on that foundational level. So things that you can very quickly do to increase the chances that people subscribe and give you their email, which is foundational again. So the first thing is value alignment, which just means that no one wants to subscribe to another newsletter. No one actually wants to get another email in their inbox every day. And at the same time, most of the time, if you see a bounce model, it'll say something like that, like subscribe today, or like join our newsletter, things like that, where no one really wants to do that. What you should really be doing is making sure that your copy is value aligned to what does someone really want out of this? Is it that they want to become a better developer? They want to get a raise in their job? They want to, in the example of Rocket Ship Jobs, they want to get a new job. So make sure that your CTA and your overall copy speaks to that, right? So get smarter, get new case studies, be clear about what they're actually getting. I'll try free charts. So that's the first thing. Second is social proof. There are so many newsletters out there today. There's no, there's no scarcity there. And so if you want to stand out, the easiest way to do so is to just use social proof. So you can see many of the newsletters here actually say the number of people subscribe. So 17,000, 32,000, 215,000 here. You can also use things like logos of companies that are subscribed or people from those companies that are subscribed. Hairdry uses one or added something new recently, which is literally testimonials on the modal itself. And so you can use a combination of these things, but you do want to use some sort of social proof to show why people should engage with your newsletter versus others, why yours is the best. And then something to mention is, again, remember I said that you can go from 1 to 2%, and that's huge. Well, the average for most modals is, I think, around 2%. And if you create a really great modal from like Harry Dries, for example, this modal, I believe, converts, or at least when I talked to him last, his modals converted at 7%, right? Which means that for 100 people, every 100 people that go to a site, 7 of them actually give them his email, give him their email. And again, this is something that does not take, in the grand scheme of things of, the fact that you have to create content and distribute it and all these things, this is such an easy way to actually accelerate your growth. The final thing is common concern. So we all know that the internet can be pretty scammy sometimes. Sometimes if you give your email somewhere, you end up on some list, you get, calls from places, you end up getting spammy emails. And so the best thing you can do if you're not scammy or spammy, which you shouldn't be, is to remind people that you're not and be very clear that you're not. So this is hard to read, but there's a couple examples here where people are saying very clearly, look, I care about privacy. Look, this email is actually only 5 minutes long. So that's another thing where if people have concerns for different reasons, in this case, people are really not wanting to get emails that are super long these days, and at least in certain cases. And so Charter does this very well where they're like, look, this email is free and it's super short, so just try it out. And then there's other examples where people are saying, you know, there's no gimmicks here, there's no freebies. They're basically talking to all the things that would make someone not want to subscribe or hesitate to subscribe, and they're being very clear about them. The final one that I'll quickly call out, which I just think is so funny but also great, is that they basically say, I will never share your email or spam you with nonsense because I'm not a dick. So that's so straightforward, but that, I think that probably increases their conversion rate a ton. Before going on to talk about a couple more quick wins, just looking at the questions. So yes, these are recorded for future access. I guess he's gone already, but every Monday we send the links out for the prior week. And also, I mentioned this on the last session, but each session has the same core content, same core slides, but the questions are totally different every single week between the two. And I add timestamps to say, like, each of the questions that are asked in each session. So you can actually just go to the other session as well, scan the timestamps and see if any of those questions are relevant to you. Kartik is asking, who is Harry Dry? So it's Harry Dry, yes, from Marketing Examples, marketingexamples.com. He's just someone that I think he only started Marketing Examples around a year ago, year and a half now, and has just completely killed it. And he embodies a lot of the things that are mentioned in this book. Yeah, okay, cool. So let's jump into this in terms of quick wins. So a lot of the things that I've mentioned so far fit into this framework of what I think is really important, in that, like, there's no right way to do things necessarily, and content is a long-term game and all this stuff. But I do know, you know, when people read books like this or attend sessions like this, they're always looking for things that they can do and they can do relatively quickly and that are actionable. So this is my kind of, in addition to everything I said, here are some quick wins if you want to take them and actually implement them today. So quick things that you can do. Add a trust bar. So similar to on the modal itself, on your site or wherever you're directing traffic to people, make sure there's a trust bar. If you go to my site, you'll see a trust bar on top of any blog post, and that just helps, again, drive people to think that you're an authority and want to engage with you. You can do the same thing with incorporating testimonials. The other thing here that I would mention is that, especially if you've been around for a long time, you may have a huge amount of content. And among that content, I'm sure there's stuff that's amazing, and I'm sure there's stuff that's not so amazing. And that's okay. That's the same thing with my content. You want to do your best to help people get to your best stuff. And you can do that if you have a newsletter by, you know, your welcome series, or some people do an in case you missed it type newsletter. Within your blog itself or on your web page, you can basically use your nav bar. You can see in mine, I think it's like best articles or something like that in my nav bar. You can have a very clear directory with a hierarchy that helps people, again, get to your best stuff, because you don't want to basically just throw them into your site or your newsletter and hope that somehow they'll stumble upon your best stuff. That's, again, this lottery technique, where instead you can be very thoughtful and intentional and maximize the chances that someone gets to your best content. And generally, you know what your best content is based on shares, traffic, things like that, how people have engaged with your stuff in the past. Similar to this, don't be afraid to resurface or repurpose existing content. If you had a wonderful article that trended on Hacker News 2 years ago, resurface it. I can bet you almost anything, unless it was a super timely topic, that people will want to engage with it again. Test headlines. One of the things that I think I see a lot of people doing these days, and I think I've benefited from as well, is recognizable imagery. So again, because there's so many people online, you want to maximize the chances that someone will want to engage with your stuff. And one of the ways to do that is to be more recognizable, where people like familiarity, right? When I look through my timeline and I see, you know, Jack from Visualize Value does this very well. He creates very recognizable, very simple, but very effective images. And whenever I see something that looks like that, an image from Jack, I'm much more likely to engage in it versus if it's the first time I'm seeing any sort of image. And so you can do yourself a lot of favors by just coming up with almost like a brand within your imagery. And that maximizes, again, you're not guaranteeing anything, but you're trying to maximize the chances that someone is going to engage with you. The other thing that's important here, so similar to how I mentioned that within the equation of creation, you have actually creating the thing, and then you have the act of getting that thing in front of people. And a lot of people don't invest enough in that second half. Well, in addition to investing in it yourself, you want to make it as easy as possible for people to go and share your stuff to help you with that second step. And so in order to do that, there's many ways to do that. But one of the ones that I really like that I saw recently is James Clear, for example. He has a 3-2-1 email where he sends out quotes. Before he sends that email, he tweets about those things first. And then he has a link to actually go and, when he sends out the email, within the email itself, it just says tweet this or retweet this. I can't remember the exact way he's done it, but he basically makes it easy where it's way less likely someone's going to read his email and go and copy that, go into Twitter and share it. But if he has first a CTA and then he makes it very easy for them to either tweet it or retweet it or comment on his existing tweet, they're much, much more likely to do that. And again, you're helping people help you. This is another example of that where within my articles, and you may have actually noticed if you read the book, I use the same tactic within the book where I made certain things very quotable. You'll see this on Medium as well, where there's a quotable segment and it's kind of segmented from the rest of the article in that it stands out, it's formatted differently. And in the times that I've done this, so my most popular article today is that How to Be Great article. And if I actually search that article URL in Twitter, for example, almost all of the shares of that article have a quote from one of these quotable sections in the book. And you can see here, it's very hard to see, but basically there are dozens of tweets about that article with a quote attached to it. And again, that quote is not something that they picked out. It's something that I made it easy for them to pick out because it was formatted differently. So quote your piece, make it easy for people to help you. Other quick things that you can do. So there's different tools like F5Bot. I'll mention this later, but these tools help you track certain keywords online. And so I track, for example, anytime that stephsmith.io shows up anywhere online on things like Reddit, Hacker News, etc. And if that happens, I go as soon as I get the email and I engage with that, whether it's on Reddit or again, Hacker News. And if you engage, you're more likely to actually help start a conversation. So that's another quick tip. It's, again, hard for people sometimes to, especially because mobile is more prevalent, it's hard for people to want to subscribe all the time. And so some newsletters, I haven't done this myself, are using authentication. So Facebook, Google logins, things like that, to actually help people subscribe to their newsletter more easily instead of typing out their email. And then the final two things are pretty similar, but it's basically that, among the tactics out there, especially the very popular tactics like social, don't forget that among all of these things, you are a human and you're creative, and you can also do things offline. So just to decouple the two, your inner guerrilla marketer. So when Morning Brew was first starting, in addition to the clipboard tactic that they use to get more emails, they also would go around and they would create these index cards, which basically had like facts or tips or trivia for business news, which is what they wrote about. And they would hand these out, and on these cards sometimes it would say, want to know the answer, go to morningbrew.com and subscribe. And so even though Morning Brew was trains passing by, even though Morning Brew is a digital publication, they recognize that, we don't need to do everything online. We don't need to just, use the traditional channels that people are using. And they understood their audience, understood what they cared about, and, approach things in a different way. Other companies use stickers. There's different ways that you can go about it, but try to be more creative than just using what everyone else does. And then the final thing is be human. So CB Insights is a great example of this, where at the end of the email, the guy literally says, like, I love you at the end of most emails. And that's something that he's written about a lot, of where there was like an inflection point in terms of the engagement that he was getting. People like engaging with humans more so than they like engaging with companies. So don't be afraid to be human, even if you're running some sort of corporate blog. Now we're almost done. Before I want to jump into a quick live demo, but the final thing I would say is, among all the things that I've talked about, the one thing that I often see people forget is that if you worked for, let's say, a corporate publication, which I've done in the past, you have quarterly goals, you have certain standards that you want to meet. You say, we want to grow page views from X to Y. What many people, especially if they're running their independent publications forget to do is exactly that, setting goals. It sounds obvious, but they're just kind of like, oh, this week I'm going to publish and, you know, I'm going to post on these channels, but what are your goals? What are like, what points or what points of traffic, what points of conversion rate, what are the actual metrics that you're trying to hit tomorrow or the next day or 3 months from now or 3 years from now, etc. So actually being explicit about those makes it more likely that you're actually going to hit them. So these SMART goals, I did not invent this SMART system, but are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So I won't go through all of them, but the idea here is that you're actually, again, you're setting things that you can measure, you're measuring them, and you're also setting things that you think you can hit and that matter. So this one thing is really important, this relevant one, because sometimes people set goals and you want to make sure that this sounds obvious again, but that they actually matter. So sometimes people will pay attention to every unsubscribe. That's not helpful. What's helpful is keeping an eye on your unsubscribe rate, let's say. But even then, is that even actionable? You want to focus on things that are actionable and relevant and actually are moving the needle for your publication. I won't go through all of these again, but this slide may help you kind of get a sense of the things that you might want to care about, the things that you might set goals towards. And these are benchmarks to help you get a sense of, okay, if I'm at 0.5% conversion rate on my site, maybe that's a really great area for me to optimize because there's a lot of room to grow, right? If the average is 2%. Or maybe if my open rate is 70%, maybe that's not something that I really want to focus on in terms of optimizing because I'm already doing really, really well. And again, just getting the unsubscribe rate is something that people pay a lot of attention to sometimes because it can be very depressing to see people unsubscribe to your content. But just keep in mind, every publication has an unsubscribe rate. And as long as yours is roughly under 1% and certainly under, if it is under 0.5%, you're doing just fine. So don't try to over optimize things and just try to make sure that you're doing well here and setting goals that matter. So before I go into the final section, which is just about competitive research, any other questions or thoughts or comments on what we've covered so far? Gonna wait 5 seconds in case anyone is typing. All right, doesn't seem like it. All right, so I'm gonna stop, oops, I'm gonna exit this and jump into basically this. I wanna demo or just show you guys a couple tools. And these tools are really important to, or they can be important and useful if you are looking for additional channels or looking for inspiration or trying to figure out what might work for you. Because remember I said something that works for one publication and one newsletter may not work for you. And so some of these tools are more B2B focused business focused, right? So if you are a corporate brand and you have a publication that reaches millions of people, these tools are super useful. But I would also say that they can be useful for independents in that you may, let's say if you're starting a finance newsletter, you may not be able to look up your direct competitors who are quite small at the beginning in some of these tools, but you can look up Morning Brew, for example, and think, this is what I want to be at some point in time, and you can draw inspiration from there. So just a couple tools to go through. So the first thing is, remember how I said at the beginning, communities can be very helpful at the beginning. They can also be helpful later on, but at the beginning in particular, Slowfile is a tool that is pretty thorough. There's a lot in here, which basically helps you discover Slack communities. So if I'm looking for, let's say again, if I want to be the next Morning Brew or some iteration of Morning Brew, I could look in here and I could say, hey, I want to know about all of the finance newsletters, or sorry, finance Slack communities. And I could go in here and you can also search by keyword as well. You can search by region, you can search by language. But let's say I don't want to just write about finance, I want to write about crypto within the finance space. And so you can see here, crypto. You can see in here there's 3 or so, 4 or so, 5, 6, so more. And this is just the first page. There's quite a few platforms or Slack communities that talk very specifically about crypto. So you can join these, you can use these to potentially meet other people who care about this in the space. You can potentially share your articles within these communities. You can potentially just get ideas for what you want to write about. So this is the first place where you can start to look for Slack communities. There's also other tools like Community Finder. There's many others out there. This is one that I've just seen more recently, which helps you find communities outside of just Slack. So you can see Slack in here, but you also see Telegram, Facebook, Discords, things like that. So again, you can see in here, if I'm looking for finance, you can also search by keyword as well. This, like I said, is a pretty new tool, so it's growing over time. But again, just look for tools like this where you are able to find communities. You can also ask, one of the best ways to find great communities, especially starting out, is to join a great community. And then once you're in that great community, say, hey, like, what other communities are you in? I see this happen all the time in the trends group where people are like, I love the trends group. I have struggled to find communities like this. Who in this community is in other communities they love? And that's a really great way to find really thriving, high quality communities. All right, so past finding communities, what else can you do? So SimilarWeb is a wonderful site that is free. There's paid tiers to it, but this is a wonderful site if, again, you're trying to consider, where do I start, right? I have so many options for channels to target, and I'm trying to get a good sense of where I might think about starting. Well, you can look up a site that is, either your competitor or something that you want to emulate. So I entered Morning Brew into here. You get a bunch of information, whether it's traffic, how that changes over time. This is really useful where, again, you're seeing where their traffic comes from. And so with Morning Brew, for example, a lot of their traffic comes from direct. They also have, some social referral traffic, 15% from something like search. Now, just to give you a kind of counterpoint to this idea of where similar types of topics, so NerdWallet is also within the finance category, have approached growth very differently. So if we look at NerdWallet's traffic comes 85% from search. And so this gives you, again, different ideas of how different publications are growing. Another thing that I want to mention here is I mentioned both of these are within the finance category. So you can see different categories within SimilarWeb. This is in finance. If I open this another tab, I get all of these other publications that I may want to explore, may want to research, may want to emulate in some way. And so you can see actually NerdWallet is down here, number 38. And so this is a great place where you can see different types of newsletters, or not even newsletters in this case, this is websites in particular, and get inspiration there. In addition to that, so we're talking about traffic, you can see referrals. And so you can see A, what is driving traffic to morningbrew.com, but also B, where is Morning Brew driving traffic to? Now, the first is much more actionable, much more useful for someone who's doing competitor research, because I want to know, okay, what is this, like Parkland School, Buffer, some guy named Tom, they're all driving a significant number of referrals or traffic to Morning Brew. I may want to reach out to these people. I may want to partner with them. I may want to just see why they're referring to Morning Brew, what tactics they're using. So you can also see more, but this is a paid feature within search. So we're going to talk a lot more about SEO next week. But another way that SimilarWeb can be useful, at least at an initial level, is you can start to see for search traffic, where are these companies getting searched? So Morning Brew's mostly getting search traffic from brand queries. But if we go to NerdWallet and go down, well, NerdWallet is actually getting, and I mentioned this particular example in the book, they're getting a bunch of traffic from these calculators that they've built. So they've built mortgage calculators, retirement calculators, cost of living, house cost calculators. And so they're getting a lot of organic traffic from these. So maybe you want to create something similar to these. Maybe you draw inspiration from these. So you can see, by the way, the same thing for paid. So paid keywords. There's many other tools to see things like this. I think SimilarWeb just gives you a good initial overview of things. So if you wanted to do paid advertising, you might consider, if you're writing about similar stuff to NerdWallet, where they're spending their money. What else here? You can see social, where they're actually, what channels they're leveraging the most for display advertising, which display networks are they utilizing? So looks like Morning Brew's mostly just doing GDN, with a couple other things. Whereas if you go to NerdWallet, you can see they're using a bunch of different ad networks. So again, you don't necessarily want to replicate this, but it gives you a bunch of ideas very, very quickly. And then finally, you can start to see audience interests, topics, competitor sites. So really great place to just get a sense of how something you want to emulate, what they're doing. Another example of a tool where you can get this information is something called Ghostery. And Ghostery is actually not invented for this purpose, but it's something that I found very useful. So what Ghostery does is it identifies what scripts are running on a particular site. So if I go to Morning Brew, Ghostery is running already, and it's showing me any of the trackers. So this is actually a privacy tool, but you can see what trackers they're running. And this gives you very direct insight into what types of acquisition they're leveraging, because they're using these pixels for this acquisition. So you can see Morning Brew advertises on Snapchat, Twitter, Taboola. They use also Pinterest, LinkedIn, Facebook. And so you know that they're using these things because they have a pixel installed. The same thing is true for NerdWallet. If I go here, they're actually involved in a bunch of different places. So if I was a company and I'm competing with NerdWallet and I have a bunch of channels and I'm looking for new channels, I could go into Ghostery and be like, hi, we're already doing Google AdWords and we're already doing Bing and Yahoo, but what's Beeswax? What's Taboola? What's Criteo and Turn? And I might explore those channels, and they may not be good for me, but it's a way for, again, you to get additional ideas in terms of what companies are doing and leveraging. And generally, you can check these things over time, and if something is running on them for a long time, you can likely kind of ascertain that it's working for them. The other way to kind of ascertain what is working for a brand is using tools like Moat and the Facebook ad library. And so you can go in here and enter any brand. So again, I've got NerdWallet pulled up here, and you can see not all, but at many of the ads that they're running. So Moat is specifically a display advertising network in terms of what they're scraping. And the great thing about this is, even if you're not a brand publication, the thing that I find really valuable about going into Moat or Facebook ad library is that it gives you so many ideas. So it gives you, you can see the copy that they're running, you can see the different types of campaigns that they're running. And it's a great place to just, again, get ideas. You can click load more. This wasn't working for me the other day. But something to keep in mind as you go through Facebook ad library or Moat is that look for trends. And what I mean by that is, if you see, let's say on Moat, if you saw 2 ads here and then, in the feed, they disappear. What that likely, it's not certainly, but likely means is that those ads were tested and they didn't work very well. Versus you can see there are so many iterations and so many versions of this ad that they're running. It's not certain again, but it's likely that this ad is working for them quite well because they've repurposed it so many times and it's been running for so long. You can do the same thing within Facebook ad library, where you can see for a given period of time, for a given location, what are the ads that they're running. So again, this is a great place to get ideas for your own ads if you want to run paid ads. But even if you don't want to run paid ads, what are these companies doing to drive acquisition? And how can you use this to actually influence your own ideas, your own thoughts, your own campaigns, things like that. So yeah, you can use this for basically, this is widely available for anyone that's advertising on the Facebook network. The same thing is true for Moat. They scrape many, many companies. Of course, they're not gonna, they're not gonna track someone like me who's, not a large brand. But if you do have a large brand, they generally will be tracked in these platforms. Other great tool, this is personally my favorite one to talk about, is this tool called Onvaka. I'm not sure why it's called that, but it's this tool to basically understand subreddits and how they relate to one another. And so this is a tool that I think is beneficial in so many ways, and I'll go through a couple. So the first one, if I wanted to start a finance blog, let's say, or finance newsletter, I would go and find a subreddit, in this case finance, and I would enter it into here. So it pulls up r/finance. If you guys can see this on the side, it tells me 412,000 subscribers, however many online. Here are some of the hot or popular posts, controversial posts, and that's cool. That's a great place to start. But in addition to that, it gives me this understanding of different subreddits. So if I wanted to use Reddit as a tool for distribution, I could say, like I'm writing about finance, but I'm also writing about fire, let's say. So I'm going to join Fat Fire, and I'm going to join Lean Fire, and I'm going to join, Financial Independence Australia, things like that. So gives me a place to go join and actually have additional distribution channels, but it also gives me, and I think this is something that is super important, especially if you're starting out, gives me an understanding of who this person is, right? If I'm vaguely writing about finance, what are the different topics that I can write about, but also who is the person, like for someone that cares about finance, what do they care about? And this finance one doesn't give as good of an overview of this, but maybe you saw it pulled up when I first went over to here. But if I'm, let's say, writing a newsletter about longevity, I kind of have a sense of someone who cares about longevity, what they might care about, what I might want to write about. But this gives me such an amazing understanding of what this person is like at a deeper level, the nuances with them. So they obviously care about longevity, but they also probably care about biohacking and their health. And so you see things like nootropics, supplements, advanced fitness in here, keto science. In addition to that, I don't even know what some of these things mean, but dark futurology, transhumanism, they're probably very technical. They care about singularity and artificial intelligence. And so this is a great tool to not only, again, come up with topics or to find subreddits to join and distribute to, but to really get a sense of who is a person, who are my 102 fans that I'm trying to reach, what do they care about? And that gives you so many benefits in terms of writing more effectively, finding these people more effectively, distributing more effectively. And so this is an amazing tool. And then once you have a particular tool, so let's say if I'm writing about or if I'm writing about digital nomadism, I go to this tool, I enter digital nomad, I get a sense of, okay, these digital nomads care unsurprisingly about travel, but they also care about financial independence. They also care about different entrepreneurship topics like SEO or startups or working online. This isn't surprising, but I can also, in addition to using this tool, I can use another tool called Subreddit Stats, which helps me. If I go to the top here, if I enter r/digital nomad in here, I get a sense of, again, their subscribers, how that's growing over time. But I can also see top submissions by year, by month. This helps me understand what are like the things that people really care about. What are the absolute top things that actually trended in this channel? I can see top keywords in here. That also helps me. Related subreddits. So there's a lot in here that between these two tools, you can learn, even if you're not planning on leveraging Reddit, you can learn a lot about your audience and certain topics that you might want to write about. So that's another tool that I recommend. And then just to do a few or two more tools. So I won't demo this one, but I mentioned it before, F5Bot. There's others very similar to this. I don't necessarily have one that I particularly recommend, but this is the one I use, and it helps me track certain keywords on these channels. So anytime, anywhere on Reddit, if stephsmith.io, for example, is mentioned, I get an email about it. Now, you want to be obviously mindful of like not putting some vague term like finance into here, because then you're going to get a lot of emails. But if there's something very particular, like for example, Financial Independence Australia, let's say you're writing particularly about that, you can put this in here and you can join conversations anytime they're mentioned. And so this is one place to look. And then the final thing is Hacker News is still, especially if you're writing about business and tech, still a great place to post. But one thing that's important here is you can learn a lot about how different companies are leveraging this platform by basically, so Hacker News has a certain query structure where if you go into news.ycombinator.com and then add this from query where site equals whatever, you can basically see how these different platforms, so if I do site equals Morning Brew, sorry, this is blocking me, Morning Brew in here, then I can basically see how many times anything from morningbrew.com has trended on Hacker News, or not even trended, been submitted. And this is really cool because you can get a sense of, oh, like Morning Brew literally does not use Hacker News as any sort of acquisition strategy, clearly. Same thing is true for NerdWallet. So these are big companies. NerdWallet, you can see this is the entire, since 2012, how many times anything from NerdWallet has been submitted to Hacker News. And you can see basically it's almost never actually reached the front page, which is cool because these are big companies that haven't actually leveraged something like Hacker News. And just to give you an opposite example, The Hustle, for example, this is not part of our like distribution strategy for every article. You can see this is a company that has leveraged this a lot more, or at least their articles have been posted on Hacker News by many people here. And it's, if you look at the timeline, Hacker News shows, I think, around 30 listings here. So within the last 3 months, something from thehustle.co has been posted on Hacker News around 30 times. And you can scroll down, you can see like the whole history and how many times it's made it to the front page, things like that. Now, something to keep in mind here is the reason I'm showing you this is not to go and be like, oh, I should use Hacker News or I shouldn't. But if there's, again, a company that you want to emulate, you may want to go see, like, are they using this tool, first of all, or is this part of their distribution strategy? And then even if it is or isn't, you can go onto here and see specific examples of, oh, okay, like, how did The Hustle make it to the front page? Like, what are the different types of articles that actually made it to the front page? Can I learn anything here? Now, The Hustle, most of the stuff that gets to the front page is all over the place. It's mostly our Sunday stories, but a good example of where this is actually a little more actionable is, let's say you're a Cloudflare competitor, or you work in the same industry as Cloudflare. Well, Cloudflare actually utilizes, when I say utilizes, it's not necessarily people from Cloudflare doing this, but it's something, it's a channel that has benefited them significantly. So if you go down here, you can see actually for Cloudflare in the last 10 days, they had 30 submissions. Again, not necessarily just from people from their company, but just people were interested in the things that they were writing about. So of all the companies that I've mentioned, Cloudflare has been on the front page of Hacker News, or been submitted to Hacker News the most. You can scroll down again and you can see, really interestingly, there are certain articles that are being not just ranking on the front page, but submitted a lot on here. And so if I happen to work for a company that wanted to be like Cloudflare or talked about similar things to Cloudflare, I would use this as an inspiration tactic to say, like, what are the things that Cloudflare is talking about that are really clearly resonating with people? And so this is, again, among the, handful to 10 or so things that I've mentioned here. This is just a suite of different tools, and there's many others out there where if you already have a strategy and it's working, great. But if you're starting out or you're trying to rethink your strategy or incorporate new channels, this is a great way to basically shortcut that process, where you're not just saying, this is what I think will work. You're utilizing information from other companies that are successful and seeing what they're doing. And so I think that is the last thing I had to say. So happy to answer any additional questions. I will, I saw one in the chat. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, because I see that, you have a lot of cool images, and Visualize Value have a lot of cool images. I was just wondering, like, how do you actually go about, getting this base of images? Because, like, as a writer, I can't really draw.
Sure. So you can, so I personally, of these images, like, I created this, these images, like the actual photography here, I can't take credit for it. That's from Unsplash. But I do think it's important, even if you're not creating, let's say, the imagery yourself, right? Like, you're not creating, let's say, an infographic here. If I go back to this slide where I showcased the imagery, let me just blow this up. So let's talk about each of these individually. My images within my blog, right? So the sharing images, these are all from Unsplash. So I just found this particular type of imagery that I liked and I felt like integrated well with my brand. So I use that. Jack from Visualize Value, he clearly creates his own. And within my book, I created my own. If you do want to create your own, like in illustrations similar to these, I'm not sure with Jackie's, but I created mine in Illustrator. And they're surprisingly easy to make if you know how to use Illustrator. And there's a wonderful course that I can recommend. I think I linked to it in the Telegram chat, but I can look it up in a second. Actually, I can just show it to you guys because I have it on my open page from before. It's on this last year. So it was this one. Adobe Illustrator Essentials Training Course. Let me just open it up so I can show you guys if you want to find it yourself. It's this one by Phil and Daniel. Yeah, so super quick course as well. If you guys don't already know this, like Udemy has sales like every other day. So if you don't want to pay $100, like I'm sure you can find it for 10 to 20 bucks very soon. Really one of the quickest Udemy courses that I've taken. You can see it's only 8 hours of content and you can literally do it in a day. And then from there, that's all I've done to learn how to create, you know, infographics like this, for example. So let me just quickly go back to here where I would say, if you want to do that, if you want to create infographics similar to the ones in this book or the ones like Jack, that's what I would recommend. Now, again, you can use Unsplash images. This company, LogRocket, they hire illustrators, so you can do that as well. Harry from Marketing Examples, you can see these are also just like stock images. He did not take these photographs. He did not create an illustration, but what he did is he added a filter, which you can very easily do in either something like Photoshop or Lightroom. So you have a specific filter that makes all of the images all of a sudden look unique and custom to you. And then a final one I give an example of is from Calvin Rosser, and he actually uses a tool, what it's called, I just remembered, the Noun Project. So I don't use this tool myself, but he uses this amazing tool, which is basically these like open source illustrations for free that not only are they free, but you can like, let me, if I do like finance here and I click this image, for example, they're super simple illustrations, but this is the amazing part of this tool. I can, let's say this is my brand color and this is my brand color. All of a sudden, like I can customize this so that it fits my brand, right? So I can do the same thing where it's like this, that's my brand. And there's so many icons within here. So if you notice, if I go back to the slides, like that's what he does. Every single one of his articles uses something from the Noun Project, and he has used kind of integrated his own branding with these 3 colors. And it works super well, and it's free. And again, open source. So you can use it for whatever project that you want. So yeah, anyway, this is kind of to answer your question. There are many ways that you can achieve this kind of recognizable look, regardless of whether you actually have the skills to create the imagery yourself. So someone mentioned you can launch Udemy in an incognito window and you generally get the discount right away. Perfect, exactly. So yeah, if you want to take this course, again, it's the Adobe Illustrator Essentials Training course. I actually took this, and that's actually what taught me how to create these illustrations. So let me make this smaller again. Any other questions, thoughts, comments on anything we've covered so far? Because that's actually all I've got. All right, doesn't sound like it. Well, thank you all for staying almost 2 hours. Really appreciate it. Hope you found this valuable. If you have any questions, if you didn't catch a link or something like that in terms of the tools, it is mostly referenced in the book, if not all referenced in the book. If you go to the end of the book, actually, many of the tools I mentioned, there's a resources section, and it links off to all of those tools. And again, like I said, there are many things in the book that I didn't cover here, like the specifics of growing on Twitter or Reddit or anything like that. So encourage you to read it if you haven't. And then, as I mentioned, each live session has different questions. So if you found this valuable, there are many other questions that were asked in the last session, and you can just go very quickly to those timestamps. So as I mentioned, that's all I've got. But hope to see you all next week. The SEO section is my favorite section. So especially if you don't know much about search engine optimization, I think you'll learn a lot next week. So hope to see you all there. And as always, thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, Steph.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.